When I think of bank robbers, I think of the presidents of the United States, or rather, former presidents. If you know, you know. If you don't, I'm talking about one of the all-time greatest bank heist movies ever, Point Break. The movie stars Keanu Reeves as FBI agent Johnny Utah and Patrick Swayze as Bodie, the leader of a gang of bank robbers known as the ex-presidents.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll. Everybody freeze!
They'd rush into a bank, screaming at everyone, brandishing rifles, all the while wearing rubber ex-president masks.
Hands up! Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are the ex-presidents, and we need just a few moments of your time. We've been screwing you for years.
In real life, bank robbers are not nearly as sexy, and the car chases are not nearly as dramatic. In fact, sometimes the police stop a bank robber because they catch him driving back and forth slowly in front of a bank and then observe him walk in and hold up the place. That's how a man named Tony Hathaway was caught, but not before he committed 30 robberies in just over a year. Tony's story is told in one of my favorite podcasts called Hooked. Josh Dean is the host and producer. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is Crime Story. Josh, welcome back to the show.
Thrilled to be back, especially to talk about this one.
Yeah, this was an absolutely brilliant podcast and absolutely brilliant story. So let's start with Tony. I want to talk about how he got himself to the place where he was a bank robber. So let's bring it back to who Tony was before he found himself in a life of crime.
So he's definitely not what you would expect the backstory of one of the most prolific bank robbers in American history to be, because he starts about as far from a criminal as a person could be. He's a engineer at Boeing, designing galleys on jumbo jets. And not only that, but he's an engineer who's the only one in his department without a high school education. So he's naturally smart, gifted, very hard worker. He's living in the Seattle suburbs because Boeing is in Everett, Washington, north of Seattle. He's got a wife. He's got 2 kids. He's got a nice house on a lake. I mean, it's pretty much, it's like such a cliche, but it's like the classic American story. You know, a guy with a high school education works his way up to this white collar job. And it's his dream job. Like, he grew up in the area. He loved Boeing. He wanted to work on airplanes, and he did it. And so into his late 20s and early 30s, he's living the dream.
Definitely not a podcast-worthy life until he hurts himself, right?
Yeah. So one day after work, Tony is playing roller hockey in the Boeing parking lot, which is something I guess he did on occasion. And he takes a bad fall and he hits his back on a curb and badly hurts his back. So badly that he needs to have back surgery. And like so many people probably listening to this who suffer from chronic back pain, it's almost crippling. It's debilitating in some cases. There are days when he can't get out of bed. And so from a life of everything going right, this one freak moment changes everything.
I mean, it really changes everything to a degree that is shocking. So he ends up going to get opioids to help his back. Like a million Americans and a bunch of Canadians.
Yeah, Americans, Canadians, and probably people around the world. And this is in the early 2000s. So, you know, I think we say that O word and people are like, oh, God, not the opioids. Like, when this happens to Tony, this is before OxyContin is a household word. So he basically goes to his doctor and says, like, nothing is working. What can you do? And then they prescribe him this miracle drug called OxyContin. And you know, a lot of people will say, I've heard this story before. It's true. Like, it was truly a miracle in the sense that people with terrible pain didn't have that pain anymore. The downside, of course, wildly addictive. So Tony, within weeks, is addicted. And fast forward a bit, what happens then is that your doctor isn't going to prescribe it to you. At least a responsible doctor wouldn't prescribe it to you long enough to fuel an addiction. So Tony, like millions of people probably, ends up addicted and he has to go to shadier sources. So the next stop is what they call pill mills, or these doctors, and I put it in quotes because they are MDs, but they're just selling pills like drug dealers, basically. And that's Tony's life. He is still holding down his job. His marriage is actually on the rocks and breaks up, I think, not because of OxyContin, but because of other things. Like, it's just a marriage that runs its course. Probably, when you hear the rest of the story, would have happened anyway. But he's living on his own now. But he's got a girlfriend. He's got a coffee kiosk. He's still a very successful member of society. The problem is he's just badly addicted to opiates, and he's going to pill mills to get pills.
And you said, like, people have heard the story before, and they have. And we have heard the story of the Sackler family and the opioid addiction and the lying to doctors and the doctors pushing this medication. Like, so we do know that story. And I have to admit, like, when I first saw this podcast drop into my feed, I actually took a while to want to listen to it because I was like, oh, I don't know if I have the heart to listen to one more of these absolutely devastating stories. But this story is beyond a story that I was ever expecting. And part of it is Tony, but his descent and the people that get pulled in are, I don't even have a word for it. Him and his son end up getting pulled in together. Can you talk to me about that? Because that to me was so heartbreaking and horrible, but he was so forthright with you about the way he told his story.
Yeah, there's so many surprises in the story. I think a lot of people like you had the same feeling where they're like, I can't do this again. I've heard too many stories of people who had it all and they lost it because of this drug. And I hate the Sacklers and I just can't, I can't imagine, but I just also can't go through it. Tony, there's so many twists in this story that are surprising, even in let's say, a narrative that you think you know. And I think this is one of the biggest ones. So, to quickly move the story forward, there's a pivotal moment in the opioid epidemic that I have to mention, which is when Purdue Pharma changes the formula of OxyContin. And they do this supposedly because they're trying to cure the problem that people are using it as a drug, a recreational drug. So they make it time release. And so you can't crush it and snort it. And the problem is they're already addicted. They're just not going to stop being addicted just because you change the drug. So what do? They go to heroin. They seek other ways to sort of sate the low. And we can talk about this in a moment, the sort of misconception over what's happening. But basically, Tony is at the bottom. He's addicted and the formula has changed and the pills are no longer doing it. And in this moment, remember, he's split from his wife and they have 2 kids. His son, Connor, is your typical sort of, teen boy from not troubled home. I mean, his parents are good parents, but he's starting to act out, and maybe it's because his parents split up, who knows. But, he's experimenting with drugs, he's getting into trouble. Tony's aware of all that, but he doesn't really know exactly what he's into. And then one day, Connor recognizes his dad as being dope sick. He sees that, the sick that Tony is experiencing is not from a virus. It's because he can't get the medicine that he needs the drug that he needs to feel okay. And Connor introduces his dad to heroin. And I've been a journalist a long time. I can't say I've ever heard this before. And in this moment, father and son start using heroin together. And I think, again, this is a moment when people are like, I don't want to hear it. I'm tuning out of the story there. This guy's an asshole. And Tony is the first to admit, and he says it on the podcast, I expect people to hate me. I'm not making excuses for this moment. I think it's reprehensible. But you can't imagine what it was like to be us in that moment. And we felt like we were safer using together than using separately. At least we could keep an eye on each other. And there's this kind of darkly beautiful period in their life starts where he's going to work, Connor's going to school, they're using heroin. They're kind of holding it together, except obviously we know he becomes a bank robber, so they don't ultimately hold it together.
Yeah, and in 2 seconds I'm going to get you there, but there is something darkly beautiful that's interesting because when you said he was an asshole, and I was like, funny, I think there were moments when I was like, oh God, it's horrible. Obviously, the father's doing drugs with the son, but it also is this incredibly intimate view of addiction. And just how, he knows this is wrong. But addiction, the disease of addiction he just lets you in a way that has no barriers around it. But he just is like, okay, this is what addiction is. It gets you to the point where you will do heroin with your kid because I'm addicted. You just did such a good job. And he was this perfect person to tell me about that.
he's a dynamic, charismatic individual, but he's also an open book. And I think that second part is the most important part. Like, he never held back on anything. And to this day, will tell me anything, whether it makes him look terrible or not. And I it's a gift in a source, especially when you're trying to tell a story like this, which is going to go to such dark places, that they have to be not embarrassed or ashamed. And even if he's feeling embarrassment or shame, he tells me anyway. And so, I think it's important to note for anyone listening who doesn't know this, and I didn't know this, like, I'm not being like wagging my finger at people, that I sort of judged addicts as using drugs recreationally in order to have fun or party or escape or whatever. And that's not actually the reality with most opioid addicts. The problem is the crash. And so, as Tony explains it on the show, what you're really doing is you're almost looking at the clock from the minute that you take drugs. You know exactly how long it's going to be before you start to feel dope sickness. And dope sickness, as he explains it, is like the worst flu you've ever had. The kind of flu where you're like, I would be happier if I was dead right now. You know, we've all been there, like in sweats on the bathroom floor with your head in the toilet, and you're just like, I can't do this.
I'm just basically curled up in a ball. I can't go to work. I can't do anything because I'm so sick. You can't eat anything. You cannot drink anything. You get dehydrated. You get sleep deprivation. And you basically just start going crazy.
That happens to you on a predictable schedule. So your entire life becomes oriented around getting the thing that will stop you from feeling that way. So now imagine father and son together, both living this calendar, and they're both trying to... Tony knows he can't lose his job. Connor still has to go to school. They have to kind of fool Tony's ex-wife and Connor's sister. And it's this like really complicated life breaks out where they're fueling their addiction, not because they're like irresponsible party guys, but because they're trying to stay, just trying to get through life, to be like members of society and not just like two homeless people who've given up, you know? And I think in that moment, and I talked to them separately about this, and I posed it to them both as like, people will say, Connor, that your dad is a terrible person for doing this, and Tony, people will say you're a terrible father. And they each said the same thing to me, was like, I was worried that if I let him go on his own, he would end up dead. Because they were starting to meet people who were dying of overdoses, right? Once you're in the heroin game, you don't really know what you're taking. So thank God this is pre-fentanyl, because it's even worse now. But like, you're buying this drug on the street and who knows what's in it. So I think they felt like, if we're together, we at least won't die.
Tony loses his job and they end up homeless. Tell me about that, and then how that led to the bank robberies.
Well, they actually end up homeless first because, you know, they're spending so much money on heroin that they can no longer afford the rent in Tony's unit because it's becoming quite an expensive habit for two people. So there's a period, relatively short period, in which they're living in Tony's Subaru in the parking lot at Boeing.
We used to come in here at night around shift change, when third shift would come on around 10:30 at night, and find a little parking spot and sit here and do our thing and watch movies on the laptop and basically just sleep.
I just remember sleeping in there, watching a movie on the laptop, smoking cigarettes and smoking heroin, and that was it.
So you were homeless but employed at Boeing? Homeless but employed and addicted to heroin.
And like, they managed to hold that down for a bit. I mean, that's definitely rock bottom. And then Tony gets suspended from his job, I believe, or takes a leave to try and get clean and is unable to. And they're so desperate for money that one night in a hotel room, they've splurged in order to have a shower and a bed. They decide to rob a bank. And they literally sketch the plan out on a pizza box. So it's like, you know, that's a movie scene, I guess, at least a very sad one that they sketch out. And Tony, remember, smart guy, engineer, I think he's like, it won't be that hard. We won't get caught. And Connor talks his dad into being the one who goes in, because he's like, you're an old guy. You have a bad back. Like, there's no way you're getting out of there if we get in trouble. I'm young, I'm fast, I'm athletic, I'm going in. So again, Tony knows how people will react to this, but he allows his son to be the one who goes in and robs the bank, and it doesn't go well.
What happens?
So the plan is that Connor will go in with a fake gun. It's a toy, not a real gun. Important.
They used a Sharpie, right, to cover the orange.
Exactly. Yes, it was a plastic gun with an orange tip that they've colored black.
You should just stop when you're talking about Sharpies.
Yes. When you're coloring a toy gun with a Sharpie, it's maybe time to
kill the plan. Yeah, kill the plan.
So Tony is in a getaway car a couple blocks away watching the bank. Connor goes in. Next thing Tony knows, Connor's running out of the bank, running down the street, and a stream of red smoke is trailing behind him. And I think I described it as like at an air show when the airplanes pull the lever and the red smoke comes out behind. A dye pack is blown up in the stolen bag.
So yeah, he's running down this sidewalk, right? With red smoke coming off of him and a car trailing him. And I'm parked right here in this parking lot. Of course, also, I hear sirens. Like, this has taken so long, the cops are actually already coming. And then I see Connor, instead of running over to where I was, because he knows this car's pacing him, he decides not to run to my car, which was smart. And he jumps over with this fence over here into the neighbor's backyard. And then when he jumps the fence...
Connor has, in the process of running away, by the way, dropped all of the money. So he's now robbed a bank but has no money. And it's another kind of tragicomic moment. And I think that episode of the podcast is actually quite funny because they're able to talk about it as like laughing at themselves because things turned out, well, okay with an asterisk, I guess. And anyway, they have no money, so they're still broke, and they end up having to beg a guy at a gas station for money to put gas in the car. And unfortunately, Connor has left behind enough evidence that he's caught. And so they're both arrested. And unfortunately for Connor, he's dead to rights. There's a fingerprint in a glove. He's going to prison no matter what. There's no evidence against Tony. So here's another moment, right, where I think people do judge Tony rightly, but also I think when you understand it, it makes some sense. They don't have any evidence on it. So they have to release Tony, basically. By this point, Boeing has fired him because they're like, you're on leave, but you robbed a bank, and whether or not you actually did it, you're in jail. Like, you can't work here anymore. So he loses his job. And Connor is going to prison no matter what. So they decide, again, together in a jail cell, like, Connor's like, Dad, you don't have to go to prison. In fact, if you stay out, you could get clean and you can get your job back. And maybe this is what we need. I'm young. I'll go do my time. I'll be a good prisoner and I'll get out and you'll be clean and our lives will be okay. And you can, again, if you can try and put yourself in their shoes, that makes some sense because it wasn't like they were offering Tony a deal where it was like, okay, if you just confess, we let the kid go. It was like Connor goes or you both go. And so it's kind of an obvious decision. I'm a father. I don't want to imagine myself in that position, but it makes some sense to me, especially if you feel like I'm going to get this shit turned around, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, Connor goes to prison. Tony doesn't.
That's not how it turns out, is it? Because while Connor does go to prison, Tony doesn't exactly get his life back on track.
No, not at all. So in another kind of, in retrospect, tragically comic scene, Tony moves back in with his mom, Candy. So he's thinking I don't have any money. I got to get back on my feet. What can I do? I'll move in with my mom. So his mom has got emphysema. She's on oxygen. She's on, I think, if not welfare, some kind of social benefits. She's she gambles on the side. She likes to go to casinos and gamble. And Tony moves in and develops this codependent relationship with his mom where she kind of relies on him to go to the store and get the bills paid. And Tony relies on her for housing, but also starts to use some of her money to support his habit. And he's, we said Tony's an open book. He doesn't hide it from his mom either. His mom knows he's addicted. She knows what's going on. And he one day just decides, I'm going to have to go back to robbing. And so at first, a couple times he does small time robbery of businesses, but very quickly realizes I don't want to steal from people. I know, I don't know the owner of this store, but I know it's someone with a family and a story, and that feels wrong to me. Banks, on the other hand, insured, no one actually loses money. I can at least squint or like, bend my moral compass a little and get behind this. But he tells his mom he's going to do it. So Candy, this woman on oxygen, who, as you can imagine, again, like this feels like a scene from a movie, like starts giving him advice almost. She was at one point a teller in a bank. So she says, Tony, we're trained not to resist. Like, it's actually, you can get fired if you resist because the money's insured. You're supposed to just comply, turn the money over, activate an alarm if it's there. And so she's like, it's actually, they're going to give you the money if you walk in. Because he's like, I don't want to have to carry a weapon. I don't want to hurt people. And she's like, you're not going to need to, because if you walk up and are menacing, they're going to give you the money. And then Tony's like, okay, well, if I get in and out in 45 seconds, the alarm, the cops won't have time to respond. And he starts to treat it like an engineering problem where he scopes out banks. He looks at how close the nearest freeway is to the location. He marks what hours they have security guards and which hours they don't. He works in the kitchen on his mom's microwave with a 45-second timer, trying to master, like, okay, if I walk in and get a mask on, I need to be able to do that, get to the counter, ask for the money, get the money, and get out in 45 seconds. And so he's practicing in front of his mom, who you can imagine is sitting there smoking, like giving him tips or whatever. Again, kind of funny, kind of not.
No, there's something darkly comedic about all of this.
There is.
You can see Danny DeVito and his mother in, what was that, Better Call Shorty or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, Get Shorty.
Kind of got Get Shorty. Yeah, it's kind of got that vibe.
Yeah. And again, it's kind of similar to the Connor-Tony dynamic, which is like, okay, is it Candy being a bad mother by like enabling her son's addiction and even encouraging him to rob banks? Yeah, probably on one hand. But on the other hand, like, she understands that he's addicted. She's seen him dope sick. She probably in her heart believes, as any parent would, that this is not permanent. Like, he's going to get himself sorted out. And if he could just get enough money, he doesn't have a job. He needs enough money to get into a treatment facility and to have like something to come back to. And I'm sure it's going to be fine. And of course, again, it's not fine. And Tony starts robbing banks and he's very good at it. So for a while, it is kind of fine. But the problem is, like, banks don't keep a ton of money in their drawers. So when we say Tony robbed 30 banks in, I think it's 54 weeks, he's not walking out of there with tens of thousands of dollars. He's walking out with like $1,500, $2,000, maybe $3,000, on a good day, $5,000. So it's a temporary fix. It's going to get you to the next week or maybe 2 weeks out, but then you're going to have to do it again. So he's very good at it, but it's not feeling super sustainable. Like, he's not on a trajectory where he's likely to hit a jackpot that's going to solve all of his problems.
I did find that shocking that he didn't really make that much money. But like, even he said, you're not going to get into the vault, right? Like, that isn't what's going to happen, which we think of all the time as like Ocean's 11 or whatever, is like getting into the vault. He just basically got that teller and maybe the one next to him to give what was in their cash, right?
Yeah, it's, you mentioned Point Break or Ocean's 11. We think of these like very elaborate plots to get some large amount of money. Those require like a lot of advanced planning and teams and usually an inside man or whatever. The vast majority of bank robbery is like this. It's one person or two maybe going into a bank, approaching a teller, getting whatever's in the drawer and running away. And it's usually, it's a couple $1,000. And in most cases, the overwhelming majority of cases, those people get caught. And I think it's important, people are like, why was Tony so successful? It's because even in the worst of his addiction, he was very careful. I think typically when people do this, they only do it once. They're super desperate in the moment. And they're probably, I've never studied this, but I would think people tilting toward opiate addiction if they're addicts, because they're watching that clock and realizing, like, if I don't get $1,000 by 8 p.m. tonight, I'm going to be dope sick. So in that moment, they rush into a bank. They haven't thought about it. They're maybe not wearing a mask. They're not wearing gloves. They're caught on camera and they get caught the first time. Tony at least is like, okay, I don't need to get caught here. Like, if I just get out in and out quickly, use the right mask, wear gloves, I'm going to be okay. And he was for a while. He just wasn't getting rich.
You do speak to a teller named Krista Kemp. And she actually, she was quite impactful. And eventually, Tony actually reacts to hearing her as well. Can you tell me about what she said and how that impacted what Tony heard?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked this because I think we talk a lot about he didn't hurt people, he didn't carry a weapon, and all of that is true. He didn't ever want to hurt people. And I think Tony is at his heart truly a good person, not a dangerous person, not a violent person, someone who wants to be a force for good in the world. And I know that's ironic. I'm telling you a story about a serial bank robber. But like, I think that's generally where it's coming from. On the other hand, he had never really thought about what it's like to be the teller who gets robbed, right? And so even if you don't have a weapon, he would sometimes pretend a finger in a pocket, or he would be menacing, and it almost doesn't matter. If you're just a person at your job at the bank and someone walks up to you, you assume they have a weapon and you're worried for your life. And that is a very traumatic experience. And so, yeah, Krista, I mean, to hear from this teller, we talked to a few. I think she's the only one we used in the show, but she, I mean, sadly had been through 2 robberies, and like it ruined her life.
You know, the repercussions of trauma that someone has to deal with can take years or affect someone their whole entire life.
I mean, she had to leave banking for that reason because she was never comfortable again. And I think Tony, in the abstract, had probably considered it, but he'd never heard it before. That caused him to feel bad in a different way than he already did. Because prior to that, the 2 times I had heard him feel bad, once was when he talked about robbing small businesses, because he's just like, that was somebody's like food money. And that's like, I can't be that person who ruined somebody else's life in the cause of like trying to save my own. The other time was for his first robbery on his own, he steals a truck that's idling outside of a guy just ran into a business, and Tony stole that, and it's kind of haunted him to this day. He still thinks about it. He's like, that was somebody's truck. That guy was probably on his way to work. Like, I'm such an ass. Like why would I do that? Like, I don't need to do that. Like, and so after that, he starts borrowing cars from addicts. But I think until he heard Krista explain the actual trauma that's experienced by a robbery victim, even when they're not confronted with a weapon, or, you know, it's over pretty quickly. Like, here she was, going on a decade later, still very upset about it. And I think he felt genuinely moved and remorseful about that.
It was actually borrowing a car from his sister that kind of got him caught, eh?
Yeah. So, you know, this was never going to go on forever. And he knew it, I think. Like, I mean, 30 times in 54 weeks is just, no matter how careful you are, there's just no way you can get away with this forever. You're going to make a mistake, or you're going to get unlucky. And in Tony's case, it was more making a mistake. He starts to get sloppy. Again, this is a guy now who's been on heroin for 2 years. He's not in a good place. Even if he's fixed more than he's not fixed, you got to imagine he's starting to cut corners. Like, he's getting a little cocky. He felt like, you know, I'm good at this and they can't catch me. And he, at one point, borrows his sister's minivan to do one of the robberies, and it's inside a grocery store. Fred Meyer's a chain out there, and it has a bank branch inside. And he actually unsuccessfully robs this one, I believe. And it's in a grocery store, so somebody follows him out, notices the car that he gets into. I believe, right, I don't remember exactly if they wrote their license plates down or if it was just the color and description or whatever.
It also had like a broken side mirror and the Seahawks sticker.
That's right. It had a broken side mirror and a Seattle Seahawks sticker. So there's probably only one minivan in the Seattle area with a broken side mirror and a Seattle Seahawks sticker. So not a problem necessarily if he had borrowed it from an addict, which he usually did, but because it was his sister's, now he's kind of sunk. But he doesn't know it. It's just, it takes a few weeks. The cops see behind the car, they stake out the house. I should say where Candy lived was a duplex and his sister lived on the other side. So the house that the minivan is in is actually the house that Tony's living in. So not only have they found the vehicle, they've actually found him. And then from that moment, they basically are just following him and waiting for him to make a mistake.
And the day they catch him, can you kind of rehash that for us? Like what it was like?
Yeah, so the day they catch Tony, he is planning to rob a bank near the University of Washington. So in Seattle, he lives up in the north suburbs. And I should say, he's starting to have to go further and further because he's so successful at robbing banks that all of the branches in his area are starting to have security guards. They're putting in more cameras. So he's going to further and further, and it's getting harder and harder. And so this is part of his like making mistakes. And he ends up way down in Seattle, picks a branch. I believe it's a Bank of America outside University of Washington. He's being followed. He actually sees the tail at one point. There's a black Suburban that he kind of spots, but talks himself out of it. It's like, oh, I'm sure that thing that just turned around and followed me is not at all a police car, even though it's a black Suburban. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. And he parks in a burger parking lot. He shoots up heroin for the last time, actually, in his life. Passes out. And so the police like drive by and observe him sort of nodded out in the minivan in the parking lot. Wakes up, goes into the bank, but of course the cops have the place surrounded now. They're just waiting to catch him in the act, basically. They kind of already know that he's at least robbed a Fred Meyer. He's probably the guy who's responsible for at least some of those unsolved 28 bank robberies. And so he comes out and it's like a scene from a movie, like a bunch of police cars, lots of guns, he down on the pavement, and that's the end of his spree. It's also, like I said, the last time he ever does heroin. He goes to jail and ultimately prison, and he's been clean ever since. I mean, there's another harrowing, it's just part of an episode, but he detoxes in King County Jail.
Yeah.
And anyone who's been through this knows how terrible detoxing from opiates is, and to do it in a jail with no medical support. Usually, if you do it in the care of medical professionals, they're able to like comfort you and give you things to make it better. And in a jail, they're not feeling bad for you. They're just like, hey, sorry, dude, you robbed a bunch of banks, suck it up.
I was hallucinating and throwing up and had diarrhea, and I couldn't sleep. It takes like 3 or 4 days to get through the worst part of the dope sickness. And during that time, you do not sleep for even 5 minutes. I mean, there's the physical pain of it, but the emotional and the psychological part of it is so overwhelming. You, honest to God, just want to die. I would have killed myself if I could have found a way.
Where is he now?
So once he gets clean, he starts to think like, they've got me on probably most of these, or at least a lot of them. If all the federal minimums are applied and it's like, he's not given any relief, he could be in prison for 30, 40 years. Like, he's definitely staring basically almost the rest of his life in prison. And so he decides like, even if I take their plea, they're going to make me admit to a lot of these. And I just, like, I can't go away. I don't think I deserve to go away for 25 years, basically. He's like, I'm not saying that I shouldn't go to prison. I should. I rob banks. I have to. I also don't think the rest of my life should be ruined because this terrible thing happened to me where someone prescribed me a drug, and here I am in a prison staring at 25 years. So he works pretty hard he spends 2 years in King County Jail, which is 1 3/4 years longer than almost anyone does. Jails are way worse than prisons. Jails, you're in a cell with a bunch of people. A lot of those people are drunk or on drugs, or they're violent, and it's just miserable. So most people take pleas because they're like, just get me to a prison where I'm going to have a TV and I'll get to go outside and I'll be treated like somewhat of a human. Jails are just not good places. But the calculus he does is like, I'm going to stay here as long as it takes for me to negotiate a good deal that feels fair, where I won't spend the rest of my life in prison. And it takes 2 years, but eventually he does. A nice defense attorney who we spoke to on the podcast picks up his case and is like, I agree with my client. Like, he's not trying to say I shouldn't go to prison. He's just saying I shouldn't do 25 years. And so I think he ends up doing, I think it's like 5 years, 6 years. It's not a long time. It's long enough that he goes to a serious prison, and then on good behavior is like slowly reduced in the severity of the prison. So in the end, by the time I met him, he's in a minimum security prison. He's got a good job in the prison office. He's like a model prisoner. He's got a TV and a hot plate in his room. And it's like not a terrible place to be. They were calling it a camp, basically. It was on the prison grounds with a maximum security prison. And he just gets sober, he stays sober, is a model prisoner, like starts working on rebuilding his relationship. But sadly, parallel to this, Connor gets out of prison. and doesn't do well because he's a teenager and now his dad is in jail. And so, like, you can imagine why for him it's not as easy. And he gets arrested again. He's now running with worse people. He gets caught with guns. Like, Connor's in a really bad, headed in a dark direction. So Connor gets sent back to prison alongside Tony, not the same prison, but a more serious prison because he's gotten in more trouble. And so Tony's really worried about Connor. And what he wants to do is get out and have Connor get out and help save the rest of Connor's life because he's only 18 or 19 years old at this point, maybe 20. And so that kind of becomes like, he obviously wants to get out and rebuild his own life, but he wants to get out and save his son. And so I guess I'm telling the whole podcast story here, but basically what happens is Tony gets out of prison and then Connor gets out of prison and they move in together in an apartment. So they're back living together, but now they're both clean. And I wish I could say that that was the happy ending, but it wasn't really.
Yeah, because tell us how he's doing. You did an update just a little while ago. They're clean and they're out of prison, but their life isn't great.
Yeah, I mean, even this part is its own little saga because I thought we would end the podcast at Tony getting arrested and going to prison and coming out clean. You know, I didn't go into it aware of how deep this relationship with Connor was and how much of the story it really is. They live in this apartment and they're both felons, right? They're both bank robbers. Connor has a gun charge. They're quite serious felons according to any person on the outside.
Sure.
And though they're having trouble finding jobs, and then the pandemic happens. And so there's Washington has fairly strict stay-at-home orders, and they're living in this one-bedroom apartment, and they're unable to find work, and they're running out of money. And it's just like a whole nother sort of depressing chapter where these two guys have kind of been to hell and back, and now life feels hopeless again. So they start drinking. And like, this is the part where I was fooled for a bit because, Tony seemed a little different, but I didn't quite pick up on it.
Yeah, I had no idea. So, like, how much are you drinking in a day?
Oh man, really? You really want to ask that?
Like a whole bottle?
Oh God, come on, Josh, you're getting a little personal.
Oh, we're just now getting personal.
I mean, is a fifth a lot?
They start drinking like a gallon of vodka a day, I think. And they're both like go from kind of 0 to 60 alcoholics. And Connor ends up having to go to alcohol treatment, comes back and is sober. Tony is able to just do it on his own, but almost kills himself, like ends up in a hospital where they're like, if you keep drinking, you will die. And, the second happy ending is like they do get clean and they're still clean to this day. The sort of tragic coda and why I did the bonus episode is that like, Tony has done his time. He's now told his story to me in about as raw a form as it could be told. He's not apologizing for anything. He's not saying that anything he did was okay, or even that, he's very angry at Purdue Pharma. He feels like he, like millions of others, deserves a settlement and that that family should be in prison, and I agree.
Yeah.
He just wants to be able to go back to work now. And he just can't get his life restarted. And I think, in the way that this story made me feel differently about homeless people, it made me feel differently about addicts. I feel pretty differently about recidivism and rehabilitation and what it means to go to prison and come back out, because I think we tell ourselves the story that we judge people and we send them to the prison and then they get to come out, and if they're good, they get a second chance. It's not actually true. I mean, yes, you could find examples of that, but I think by and large what happens is that these people wear a scarlet letter for the rest of their lives. And when Tony has to check that form on a job application that says, are you a felon? He checks yes, and no one ever calls him back. Like, I think in the last 2 years, he had 2 or 3 callbacks, and he's willing to take like crappy. He's like, I just like want to work. I could be a manager at Walmart or something. Like I was an engineer. I can definitely manage a store, like, but no one will call me back. I'm not even getting interviews. And then like the tragedy on top of tragedy, or irony, I don't know what even the words to use are, that his real dream is that he wants to go back to Boeing. He kind of wants to circle all the way back to the beginning of the story and start over. And just like, he's like, I don't need the same job. I'll start at the bottom of the department again. But like, I designed a lot of airplanes. I know what I'm doing. I have a lot of experience. I did these bad things, but now I'm clean. I'll get drug tested every day if they want. And so he keeps applying and he keeps applying and he keeps applying. And then one day he gets called back and he gets an interview. And then he gets a second interview and he's basically told they're going to hire him back. And I'll never forget, he wrote to me and then we talked on the phone and he was so excited. And then you can kind of imagine where this is going. They hire an outside company to run a background check. And of course, the background check comes back and says, wait, this guy's a serial bank robber. He's a felon. Therefore, we cannot allow Boeing to hire him. And Boeing has to take the advice of this company it's hired to run background checks because of some policy that he's never informed of, or like he can't actually get an explanation for them as to why it was okay for their managers to basically offer him a job. But then this firm comes in and runs a background check and discovers a thing that's definitely not a secret. As I said, I wrote a number of letters on his behalf, and one of them I remember during an appeal period I wrote, and I was like, you didn't need a background check company. Like, I wrote a magazine story. I made a 9-part podcast. Like,
You just had to Google his name.
yeah, like this is not a thing he's hiding from the world. In fact, he has told the whole thing, warts and all. And so this makes no sense to me. Like, it's not like you caught him in a lie. It would be one thing if he had gone in and been like, well, I was traveling for 9 years. That's why I wasn't working. He's like, no, I did. Here's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah.
And so that's where we are today. It's like, sadly, he didn't get the job. He's tried to appeal it. I've written letters on his behalf. I think other people are. I get messages from people like, can I start a GoFundMe? You know, like he doesn't want to like take handouts. He just wants to go back to work. And I just keep hoping someone in Boeing PR will hear one of these things and just walk into the like C-suite and be like, guys, we could
This is a good news story.
Good PR right now. Like, I'm not sure if you've looked at our PR clippings, but things are not going great for Boeing. Like, people think we're killing whistleblowers. Our planes are falling out of the sky. Like, we are not the American icon that we used to be. Like, this would be a great story. We hire him back. He'll get drug tested all the time. It's just like, sadly, hasn't happened yet. I still hold out hope. And in the meantime, I just want, I guess the less exciting version of that is like somebody in the Seattle area hears one of these interviews I've given or listens to the podcast and it's just like, I'll hire Tony to manage my gas station or something, which he would happily do. I think he's had some health problems, but like he just, I think, is in a bit of a rut and I feel bad for him. I mean, it's not my job as a journalist to find him work, but also you can't spend this much time talking to somebody and not get invested in their story. And like, I don't think deserves where he is right now.
You're invested in this story, though, in a pretty intense way, more than I think any of your other stories, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Like, I tend to do these stories where I spend a lot of time, Clearing or White Devil are two good examples where I spent a lot of time with one source or a primary source over a course of years. But this is now going on 5 years, I think, since I first met Tony, maybe 6. And the difference, I think, is that like I covered it because of the pandemic. I was able to take my time. And I think this had an effect on the way the podcast turned out was because my company, Campsite, was pretty new. I knew I wanted to make a podcast, but I didn't know who would distribute it. And we were all stuck at home. And so Tony and I were just talking every other day, once a week, twice a week, like all the time. And so like he was a part of my life in a way that no source ever has been before. And I also just saw so clearly how he was wronged by companies and society, and that just wasn't fair. And so it's very hard for me to just be objectively like, sucks for Tony. I wish I could do something, but I'm just not allowed because I'm a journalist. I'm like, that's why I wanted to do the bonus episode. I just like, I think I should keep telling the story because maybe someone will finally listen. And by the way, there are a lot of other Tonys out there. Like, I don't want to say like, I'm spending all this attention on one person. Like, one reason I wanted to tell his story way back in the beginning was for the reason that you said at the beginning of the podcast. And I was just like, I know this one is different and I know this has a chance to break through. And if you look at, and I usually advise people not to do this, but if you go to Apple Podcasts and read the reviews of Hooked, they're pretty awesome. And it's not like, you're so great, Josh. Like, that's not what I'm looking for. It's like, I never understood the opioid epidemic until I listened to this podcast. I now understand what my brother's going through. I can send this podcast to my mom and maybe I'll be allowed to come home for Christmas next year. It's like I'm getting home. I'm getting like choked up thinking about it because it's like, how many people are in this position where they've been judged and told they're terrible or they've lost everything and they're just like, no one feels sympathy for me. They're like, you were a heroin addict. So I think I hope in Tony's story that it allows a lot of people to have that same journey of, wow, okay, I didn't get it. I get it now. And by the way, it's not just opiates. All addictions are diseases, and I think addicts deserve better treatment, right? We should be helping them and not judging them.
Well, Josh, this was great. Thank you so much for talking to me. I mean, honestly, it really was one of my favorites. So the idea that I could sit and talk to you for 45 minutes about it was just cool. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. You can probably tell I love talking about this one.
It's a great one.
It means a lot to me.
Okay, well, we'll talk to you next time we have another podcast out.
All right. Look forward to it.
You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. There are a lot more episodes of Crime Story available right now. Just search for Crime Story on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can get our episodes ad-free and a week early by subscribing to the CBC True Crime channel on Apple Podcasts and following CBC Podcasts on YouTube for exclusive behind-the-scenes video content. Crime Story is hosted by me, Kathleen Goldhar. Our producers are Nikki Manfredi and Mitchell Stewart. Sound design by Julian Uzielli and Mitchell Stewart. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner. Our video producer is Evan Agard. And our YouTube producer is John Lee. Audio sourced from Disney and Campside Media's podcast Hooked. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager of CBC Podcasts, and Arif Noorani is the director of CBC Podcasts.